Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at First Baptist Church. I'm happy that you can be here with us today as we continue our study in the book of 1 Kings. We're in chapters 14 through 16 today, and in these chapters we'll be examining some of the kings during the first years of this divided kingdom. And, as we talked last session, the historian who writes 1st and 2nd Kings it covers the whole story, both north and the south, but his ultimate focus will be on the line of David because that's where Christ comes from. In addition, as we'll see coming on in the next session, the session following, more and more we have prophets who play a prominent role in the kings. They're the people who move God's work forward. They're the people who bring things into focus as we're looking at the book of Kings. I want to start today by looking at a chart because I think it gives us a good idea of what happens here in this first part of the history of the divided kingdom. If you look at that chart, you see that we have Judah on one side and the kingdom of the north, Israel, on the other side. And if you look at that just real quickly, you notice that there are fewer kings on the side of Judah than there are on the side with Israel. And you see that Judah has some long reigning kings. In fact, Asa and his son Jehoshaphat both reigned for quite some time. On the right side, you have even one king who only reigned for 7 days, Zimri. And that should tell you something about what's going on during that approximately 40-year period that we're going to examine today. The northern kingdom was outside of God's will, and that they suffered the consequences as a result. The southern kingdom, because of Asa primarily, they were in tune with what God's will was for Asa and for the kingdom in the south. But in the north, it's a story of violence and death and sin and political instability. I want you just to listen to the fate of some of these kings here that are shown in that chart, beginning with Nadab, the son of Jeroboam. He followed his father who died of natural causes. But Baasha assassinated Nadab and wiped out Jeroboam's entire line of succession. That's in 15:27 through 30. Sound cruel? It's pretty common practice in the Near Eastern cultures that we're looking at in ancient Near East to wipe out the line of succession of a king that you might succeed, just to prevent people from challenging you for the throne. The prophet Jehu, the son of Hananiah, pronounced judgment against Baasha, and he would get the same thing happening to him by Zimri in just a few years. And Zimri, who was a military leader and killed Elah, the son of Baasha, and became king, he only served for 7 days. And his life was threatened by Omri, and he took his own life rather than face the music with Omri. Omri would become one of the stronger kings of the northern kingdom, and his son Ahab would follow him. Omri would be the person who would make Samaria the capital of the northern kingdom. But all of these kings that you see on that right side there, they're all assessed by the historian, where he says he did evil in the eyes of the Lord after each one of these kings. On the side that follows follows Rehoboam and down to Asa and Jehoshaphat, they did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And so as we look at these people and we look at Asa in particular, Asa did what was right. He undid some of the practices of Rehoboam. He consecrated gifts back to the temple. He focused his commitment on God's will, and he made sure that the worshiping of God was carried out in the right way. As we hear about Judah, we're not allowed to forget Israel, though, and that's the style here that we write about. Parallel to one another, we're going to see the lives of these kings and their reigns play out. And so we're going to begin here in chapter 15 with verses 1, 3 through 5, and 8. And it's going to take us through several different generations here of different kings in the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. First, we'll look at the southern kingdom at Judah. Look at chapter 15, beginning with verse 1. In the 18th year of the reign of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Abijah became king of Judah. He committed all the sins of his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord, his God, as the heart of David, his forefather, had been. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up a son to succeed him and by making Jerusalem strong. For David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord and had not failed to keep any of the Lord's commands all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. And Abijah rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, and Asa his son succeeded him. Several interesting things about this passage, and then we'll get to Asa. First of all, Abijah became king. You'll see that spelled Abijam in some other translations with an M at the end rather than an H. And he's not really one of the people that the author focuses on, but he does commit the sins of his father. He commits the sins of his father Rehoboam. And so he's not given very many good marks. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord, the author says here. But he says that because God wanted to bless David and David's line, there is a gift that comes through Abijah, and that's the gift of a son named Asa. He is going to provide for Israel what the author calls a lamp in Jerusalem. It's a light in the darkness. There would be hope in the midst of hopelessness because of Abijah. And that's why he's important. But Asa is going to be that hope. He's going to be that light. But his father, even though he was evil, he's the person who provides Asa for us. Now look in verses 9 and 10. It says, in the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Asa became the king of Judah. And he reigned in Jerusalem 41 years. His grandmother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. Now, Asa became the king of Judah, and he was one of the longest serving kings in the history of Judah. He served over 40 years, and his religious reforms brought about a revival similar to what happened when King Josiah, the good King Josiah, came along. That's going to be several hundred years down the road. And he was also adept at handling the political situations around him, as we'll see as we move forward and look at his reigns. Let's see what the writer has to say about Asa beginning in verse 11 of chapter 15. He says, first of all, most important, Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. He expelled the male shrine prostitutes from the land, got rid of all the idols his fathers had made. He even deposed his grandmother, Maacah, from her position as queen mother because she had made a repulsive Asherah pole. Asa cut the pole down and burned it in the Kidron Valley. Although he did not remove the high places, Asa's heart was fully committed to the Lord all his life. He brought into the temple of the Lord silver and gold and articles that he and his father had dedicated. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. In fact, the word that's right there, it's the same word used throughout. It is a word that in Hebrew that can mean straight, but it has a deeper meaning than that. It suggests a behavior that conforms to the will of the watching Lord. Does your behavior conform to the will of the watching Lord? That's an awesome thought to think about, because the implication here is if God watched Asa, he watches us. And God wants us to conform to his will for our lives. And he's watching us. That's scary too. It's awesome, but scary. When Asa became king, the country that he lived in desperately needed a good spiritual example. Notice in here they mention his grandmother, Maacah. Maacah was a worshiper of Asherah poles. And because of that, her grandson removes her from her official position as the queen mother, which was an official position probably in most of the royal courts of his day. And he takes down her pole and he burns it in the Kidron Valley, which was between the temple and between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. And it's mentioned many times in the New Testament. And he deposed her. I mean, that took somebody who was bold. That was a bold move for a king to do that. He removed the male cult prostitutes who had been brought in by his father. And he replenished the treasury of the house of the Lord that had been depleted by Pharaoh Shishak, who came and demanded tribute from Israel. And it says that he repaired the great altar, he removed some of the high places, but not all of them. But the writer doesn't hold that against him. He says he still is a person who did what God wanted him to do. His heart was fully committed to the Lord. And that's, if you're one of the characters in this part of 1 Kings, that's what you want to hear said about you, that you're fully committed and you do what's right in the eyes of the Lord. Now look at verses 16 through 19. This is an account of a little incident between Asa and Baasha. There was war between Asa and Baasha, the king of Israel, throughout their reigns. Baasha, king of Israel, went out against Judah and fortified Ramah to prevent anyone from leaving or entering the territory of Asa, king of Judah. Asa then took all the silver and gold that was left in the treasuries of the Lord's temple and of his own palace. He entrusted it to his officials and sent them to Ben-Hadad, son of Tabrimon, the king of Hezion, the king of Aram, who was ruling in Damascus. Let there be a treaty between me and you, he said, as there was between my father and your father. See, I am sending you a gift of silver and gold. Now break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so he will withdraw from me. Actually, this is a pretty shrewd political move on the part of Asa. He wanted to get Baasha out of those cities they were protecting trade routes. And actually what Baasha was trying to do was to put up an economic blockade of Asa. And he wanted to isolate Judah as much as he could. But Baasha sent this gift, which in more realistic terms we would call a bribe, to the king in Ben-Hadad, who was in Damascus, and said, withdraw your support from Baasha. And he did. Now, I will say this, because he did that rather than calling on the Lord to do something for him, he gets some criticism for not trusting in God's protection. And so he didn't depend on God in this case, but in other cases he would. Ben-Hadad, it says in verse 20, if we look at that, Ben-Hadad agreed with King Asa and sent the commanders of his forces against the towns of Israel. He conquered Ijon, Dan, Abel-Beth, Maacah, and all of Kinnereth in addition to Naphtali. When Baasha heard this, he stopped building Ramah and withdrew to Tirzah. And that's exactly what Asa wanted. He didn't want to be cut off from the rest of the world. He wanted to be able to have those avenues of trade and transportation in and out of his own country. The text does not reveal what steps Baasha took to defend against Ben-Hadad, but perhaps the retreat from Ramah was the most important thing that we see here. Then look in verse 22 through 24. It says, Then King Asa issued an order to all of Judah. No one was exempt, and they carried away from Ramah the stones and timber Baasha had been using there. With them, King Asa built up Geba in Benjamin and Mizpah. And for all the other events of Asa's reign, all his achievements he did and the cities he built, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? In his old age, however, his feet became diseased. Then Asa rested with his fathers and was buried with them in the city of his father David, and Jehoshaphat, his son, succeeded him as king. Some interesting things here. Asa had a good plan. He called on all the people. He said, I want you to go and get all those building materials that Baasha's been using in Ramah. We're going to use them to build up our defenses. Nobody was exempt. Can you imagine this huge migration of people going and picking up all these building materials, rocks and timbers and so forth, and bringing them by hand to the place where Asa needed them to build up his own defenses? Now, there's an interesting story here that we don't that we don't hear about too much, and that's about a disease in Asa's feet. We don't know what they were, but again, Asa doesn't call on God for healing, but he apparently suffered this, especially in old age. A lot of scholars think that probably he had gout. But these two incidents in his life, even though he did what was right in God's eyes, he was devoted to God, he could have called on God to help him in both of those. And so we're going to shift from Asa now. All this is taking place during Asa's reign, but we're going to shift from Asa to the northern kingdom. So I want you to look at chapter 15, verse 25. Verse 25, where it says that Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, became king of Israel in the second year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel 2 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, walking in the ways of his father and in his sin, which had caused Israel to commit. Baasha, son of Ahijah, of the house of Issachar, plotted against him, and he struck him down at Gibeathon, a Philistine town, while Nadab and all of Israel were besieging it. Baasha killed Nadab on the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, and succeeded him as king. As soon as he began to reign, he killed Jeroboam's whole family. He did not leave Jeroboam anyone that breathed, but destroyed them all according to the word of the Lord given through his servant Abijah the Shilonite. And it was for the sons of Jeroboam which he sinned, and which he had made Israel to sin, and because of the anger to which he provoked the Lord, the God of Israel. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, walking in the ways of Jeroboam and his sin, which he had caused Israel to commit. You know, the author is pretty plain here. He has a formula by which he writes. This king is a person who does evil. He followed in his father's footsteps. In fact, he loses his life to an assassin. And because he loses his life from an assassin, the author does not even give him the privilege of being treated like other people, other kings in the book of the Kings. He doesn't say he slept with his fathers. He just ends his life and that's it. And so he didn't end his life in a natural way. He was killed, he was assassinated, and so the author doesn't give him the privilege of the kind of eulogy that came about. The point here is that beginning back in Baasha's reign, we began a line of people who come to power by disreputable means, by evil means. And the author is going to tell us about all of those things. It's important to note here that that when they say they did evil, these kings in the northern kingdom did evil, it all points back to what Jeroboam had done with the golden calf. And he sinned, and the author says he made the people of Israel to sin by what he did. Would you like to be known as a person who makes other people to sin? He didn't lead people to do good things. He led people to do bad things. And that was true of Jeroboam, and that was true of Jeroboam's son and Baasha. They all did the evil in the sight of the Lord and made other people sin. Now look at chapter 16 as we begin there. In chapter 16, we have a prophet, a new prophet. Now he's not going to be one of the people that's repeated over and over, but he's a prophet. It says, Then the word of the Lord came to Jehu, son of Hanani, against Baasha. I lifted you up from the dust and made you leader of my people Israel, but you walked in the ways of Jeroboam and caused my people Israel to sin and to provoke me to anger by their sins. So I'm about to consume Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like that of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Dogs will eat those belonging to Baasha who die in the city, and the birds of the air will feed on those who die in the country. In the Old Testament, there are always some tough words and some tough scenes, some tough pictures that are drawn for us. And you might say here for Baasha, what goes around comes around. The old adage is correct, that Baasha had wiped out the line of Jeroboam, and now the word of the Lord comes to Jehu, and he says, you are going to meet a similar fate, and your line is going to be wiped out. And that would be exactly what Zimri would do, even though he only had 7 days to do it. Zimri only reigned for 7 days. And so in that short amount of time, he took care of what the prophet said was going to happen. When God says it's going to happen, it happens. And even if you don't have somebody who's around for very long. Now look at verses 8 and following. It says, in the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Elah, son of Baasha, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Tirzah 2 years. Zimri, one of his officials, who had command of half his chariots, plotted against him. Elah was in Tirzah at the time, getting drunk in the house of Arzah, the man in charge of the palace at Tirzah. Zimri came in, struck him down, and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah. Then he succeeded him as king. As soon as he began to reign and was seated on the throne, he killed off Baasha's whole family. He did not spare a single male, whether relative or friend. So Zimri destroyed the whole family of Baasha in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken against Baasha through the prophet Jehu. Because of all the sins Baasha and his son Elah had committed and had caused Israel to commit, so they provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger by their worthless idols. And notice all this is framed against the reign of Asa, and the years are put in terms of when he reigned. But these people are evil. And what we have happening in the northern kingdom may sound to us like a banana republic with changes in power that occur after violent acts have been done. And as we see, they happen quickly sometimes. Look in verse 15 and following, and it talks about Zimri. In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned in Tirzah 7 days. The army was encamped near Gibbethon, a Philistine town. When the Israelites in the camp heard that Zimri had plotted against the king and murdered him, they proclaimed Omri, the commander of the army, king of Israel, that very day there in the camp. Then Omri and all the Israelites with him withdrew from Gibbethon and laid siege to Tirzah. When Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the citadel of the royal palace and set the palace on fire around him, so he died. He committed suicide is what he did, because of the sins he had committed, doing evil in the eyes of the Lord and walking in the ways of Jeroboam and in the sin he had committed and had caused Israel to commit. Now the whole army gets involved in naming the king. And you see the turmoil. You see the violence. You see the sin that goes on here. And when that happens together, it creates a really unstable situation. In the meanwhile, Asa's down in the southern kingdom, and he's reinstituting the worship of Yahweh in the temple. And he's doing away with the Asherah poles, and he's bringing about a revival in God's kingdom. He was the lamp in Jerusalem, remember. He's the light that shines in the darkness, and he carries it forth. And so here comes Zimri. He only rules for a short time, and then Omri. Now Omri will be a king that brings some stability, and look what he does, because he will establish Samaria as the capital of the northern kingdom. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became the king of Israel, and he reigned 12 years, 6 of them in Tirzah. He bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver and built a city on the hill, calling it Samaria, after Shemer, the name of the former owner of the hill. But Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and sinned more than all those before him. I want you to note that last part of the sentence. Not only did he do evil, he sinned more than everybody before him. That's pretty harsh. He walked in all the ways of Jeroboam, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and in his sin which he caused Israel to commit, so that he provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger by their worthless idols. As for the other events of Omri's reign, what he did and the things he achieved, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel? Omri rested with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab, his son, succeeded him as the king. You notice the formula there? You always can look in the book of the annals of the chronicles of the kings and find out what else he did, but the writer of Kings is not going to tell you everything that he knows. And he always assesses these people. Either they were evil, they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, or they did what was right. Now, one thing that Omri did that's going to be important in the chapters to come, he made Samaria the king or the capital of Israel. And remember, that whole region would be called Samaria during Christ's day, and it was so detested by the Jews of Judah that they would not even pass through it. They would cross the Jordan River, walk up the other side, so that they did not have to pass through Samaria. Christ didn't, though. He passed through Samaria, as we know, on more than one occasion. Obviously, from these events that were happening in such short order, the verses about the northern kingdom, they were suffering. They were suffering from political turmoil, from military chaos, and they really, it threatened their complete collapse. You know, and I used the term a while ago, banana republic. When you get in that kind of situation, what happens is there's someone who's strong who comes and takes control of the situation. And the northern kingdom at this point was ripe for someone who was strong, either a strong man or a strong woman. And the northern kingdom actually got both of them. Ahab, who was a strong man, Jezebel, his wife, who was a Sidonian and who worshiped Baal and would bring Baal worship to the northern kingdom. They would rule with a much stronger hand than the people before him. However, as we'll see, and this is pointing to the future, God has someone equal to the task in the person of a prophet named Elijah. And he would be God's champion in the midst of these days in Samaria. But let's finish this story here of King Asa in the southern kingdom. In the 38th year, in verse 29, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became the king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. Notice, Ahab did more evil than anybody before him, he says. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ithbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel before him. Bad dude, bad dudess. I mean, they were a couple to be reckoned with, as we shall see. John Traylor in the Layman's Commentary describes Ahab as undaunted by God's judgment upon the other wicked kings in their houses. He plunged deeper into wickedness than any who reigned before him. He not only perpetuated the evil practices of calf worship, but pressed Baal worship on Israel as well. He considered the previous sins of the people of Israel, of the kings of Israel, to be trivial. He wanted more. This is almost like a drug addict. He wanted a bigger high. He wanted to commit bigger sins. He wanted to do more things. And we'll see he did it. When we think about all these kings that we've looked at here in just this brief amount of time in this lesson, the only thing we have available to us in making judgment about them is the record that's left here. And in all cases, I said, they're judged, each one of them. You know, the Bible says that it's appointed unto man once to die. And we forget the second part of that. And then the judgment. And the writer's providing that judgment here for us. Either they did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, or they did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And from each one of their cases, there was really not much gray area. They made it easy to decide whether they were good or evil based on their actions. I think that if we think about that a bit, what I read in one of the sermons by Alexander McLaren on these chapters here sums up for us what we need to be aware of in our own lives. Look at this statement. McLaren says, our lives will all come down to this at last. How did he stand towards God and His will is the final question that will be asked of each of us. And the answer to it is the only thing that concerns the dead or the living either. He was a great scholar. He made a fortune. He rose to be a peer. She was a noted beauty, a leader of fashion, a queen of society. What will all such epitaphs be worth if God's finger curves silently below them and writes, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord? All of that means nothing if you do what is evil in the sight of the Lord. That's important to us. It's important to us in how we live our lives on a daily basis. Are you seeking to live out your life according to God's will for your life? Do you realize that God has a will for your life? I can testify to that. I can testify that God has a plan for your life. Now, sometimes I've deviated from it, and that was a mistake. It would get me back on track, though. And God has a plan for you, and you need to seek that plan out. You need to seek that will out from God. David wrote in Psalm 24 these words. Listen to what he said. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For He founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. Who may ascend the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in His holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to an idol or swear by what is false. That's a really stiff measuring stick for us to be measured by. Now, when I thought about that, I thought about a popular worship song that's still used in many of our churches today. It's entitled, Give Us Clean Hands and Give Us Pure Hearts. Listen to the words to that song. We bow our hearts, we bend our knees. O Spirit, come make us humble. We turn our eyes from evil things. O Lord, we cast down our idols. So give us clean hands and give us pure hearts. Let us not lift our souls to another. O give us clean hands and give us pure hearts. Let us not lift our souls to another. O God, let this be a generation that who seeks your face, O God of Jacob. O God, let us be a generation that who seeks your face, O God of Jacob. And my prayer for you today is that you do seek the God of Jacob, and you do lay down those idols as you worship God. In fact, as this lesson goes out on the internet on Sunday morning, we'll be on the eve of our 246th birthday of independence in this country. And there could be nothing more important for us today to think about approaching this holy hill of God, casting down our idols, and seeking to have a pure heart and humbling ourselves before God. We are a nation with so many problems, but we are a nation that was founded on the idea that God's will was being done and that we were following God's will. So if we're going to follow God's will, we need to be like what the songwriter says here in the worship song. We need to bow our hearts, bend our knees. We need to be humble, and we need to throw down all the idols that we have. and we need to seek God's will singularly, away from anything else. And then all those other things will be taken care of. That's my prayer for our country today, and it's my prayer for you individually as well. Thank you, and have a good week.